look up at the night sky probably every single night, and I wonder all the time what we're not being told about space. And I fell down this rabbit hole, and it's just a little aside, but I thought you should see this. Radio listeners on October 4th, 1957 may have heard a series of beeps coming over their radios, as that's the day history generally acknowledges that the Soviets launched Sputnik.
On October the 4th, 1957, while the Americans were still finalizing their plans, Sputnik was launched.
Which I think is pronounced Sputnik, but I'm going to pronounce it Sputnik, because Sputnik sounds ridiculous. Sorry, I'm not going to do it.
CBS Television presents a special report on Sputnik 1, the Soviet space satellite. Douglas Edwards reporting.
Until 2 days ago, that sound had never been heard on this Earth. Suddenly, it has become as much a part of 20th century life as the whir of your vacuum cleaner.
Sputnik was the first man-made satellite put into orbit, which beat out the U.S. Vanguard satellite and officially touched off the Cold War space race. In fact, just a month afterwards, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev was on the front page of U.S. papers challenging the U.S. to a competition of space Sputniks. Which just sounds lame. I mean, you should just go with space race. Competition of space Sputniks just sounds silly. Sputnik is the single event that is credited with the entire reason why President Eisenhower created ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, on February 7, 1958, which would eventually be changed to DARPA, but also the creation of NASA, which was made official with the National Aeronautics and Space Act of 1958, which was passed and signed into law that July. And then a few months later, in September 1958, the National Defense Education Act was passed as well, again in response to the launch of Sputnik. And on the official Senate website for the NDEA, it actually says there had been strong resistance to federal aid to education, but as public opinion demanded government action in the wake of Sputnik, blah, 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 had to shove this through. The launching of Sputnik is so central that it's credited not only with changing the entire course of the Cold War, but with the official start of the space age.
Already, many plans are being advanced for the coming age of man in space.
And the other part of that story that's gone down in history is this idea that Americans were just so hysterical and terrified that the Soviets launched a satellite into space that it is now in the 21st century been referred to as the 9/11 of its time.
Sputnik was the 9/11 of our day. People were shocked that Russia had a technology that could do this, and we didn't.
Today, a new moon is in the sky, a 23-inch metal sphere placed in orbit by a Russian rocket. Here, an artist's conception of how the feat was accomplished.
Former chief historian of NASA, Roger Lanius, wrote, quote, Sputnik Night, as 4/5 October has come to be called, reverberated through the American public in the days that followed. 2 generations after the event, words do not easily convey the American reaction to the Soviet satellite. The only appropriate characterization that begins to capture the mood on 5 October involves the use of the word hysteria. A collective mental turmoil and soul-searching followed. And that's the way he's writing about it. It's very, very dramatic. It sounds like everyone was freaking out. And they even have a term for this. They call it the Sputnik crisis. And Wikipedia has an entry on it, which defines it as, quote, a period of public fear and anxiety in Western nations about the perceived technological gap between the United States and Soviet Union caused by the Soviets' launch of Sputnik 1. And they also mention on there that there was a crisis reaction in the newspapers with outlets like the New York Times mentioning Sputnik in 279 different articles between October 6, 1957 and October 31st, 1957. In fact, on October 6, the New York Times quoted an unnamed naval scientist who claimed the very fact that the satellite is whizzing around the Earth would indicate that the Russians are ahead in rocketry. It means that the Russians must have the intercontinental ballistic missile. And on the following day, the New York Times suggested that the Soviet Union would soon have enough missiles to place every major United States city and base under threat of annihilation. So that's the tack they were taking with this. And the story that gets told now is about how Americans were suddenly faced with the fact that America wasn't the supreme scientific nation on Earth, and people were just so disheartened by that.
What about the vital question that everybody is thinking about? Why and how did the Russians beat us to the draw?
And also extremely fearful that Soviets sending up Sputnik would be a means to eventually allowing them to nuke America from space, and that people were generally just beside themselves with anxiety over this. But what I found was not at all like how that's portrayed. I found articles about how the Pentagon was worried sick and Congress was fighting over it because there was an election coming up. I found Speaker of the House John McCormick quoted as saying the United States faces national extinction if they don't respond quickly. It cannot be, here's a quote from him, "It cannot be overemphasized that the survival of the free world, indeed all of the world, is caught up in the stakes."
I tell you, gentlemen, science has agreed that unless something is done and done quickly, man as the dominant species of life on Earth would be extinct within a year.
Which is interesting because buried in the middle of the Edmonton Journal, I also found an article about U.S. Senator Homer Capehart, who apparently went over there and evaluated their scientific and industrial progress and said he wasn't very impressed because what he describes as going on is a lot of propaganda that sounds vaguely North Korea-esque. He was there for 2.5 weeks, and he said leading stores, for example, which are all owned by the government, conducting these lavish fashion shows where they have visitors from Asia and the Middle East, and they have models strutting around in these gowns to orchestra music. But at the end of the show, if you go ask about these dresses, the store tells you they don't have any of these things on hand. All they have are patterns, which you could use to make it yourself if you can find material anywhere with which to do that. He says there's also an industrial exhibit spread over several acres of land, which has the very latest design machine tools and farm equipment and stuff like that in these well-architectured, ornate buildings. But he didn't see any of that equipment in the hands of the people anywhere. So it all, to him, appeared to be much like a show or Potemkin Village. And he says, I'm not trying to minimize their scientific achievement or anything, but it's just, there's something here that's not adding up, is basically what you get out of this article. A lot of what I found comes off as propaganda about fear that people should be having, more than reporting on actual public concern or anxieties itself. Like this article that was created at the request of the United Press and then syndicated for like a month in newspapers all over the country, written by the very Reverend James Pike about how more fear would be good for the U.S. and how he's afraid Americans aren't afraid enough about Sputnik, which can be seen in his view as God's judgment on Americans for resisting taxation for scientific advancement.
Problem, reaction, solution.
I also found an article where you have psychologists saying that Americans are nervous and they should blame Sputnik, but as soon as the government launches one of our own satellites, that anxiety will disappear, which again just sounds like more defense propaganda. Oh, and I did find one radio station that actually went directly from reporting on Sputnik to just playing Orson Welles' War of the Worlds from 1938 without any introduction.
Yes, I guess that's the thing directly in front of me, half buried in a vast pit. Must have struck with terrific force. The ground is covered with splinters of a tree. It must have struck on its way down. But I can see the object itself doesn't look very much like a meteor. At least not the meteors I've seen. It looks more like a huge cylinder.
Prompting like 60 phone calls from listeners concerned that Sputnik, despite being about the size of a beach ball, was somehow able to land hostile Russians in North America. Far outweighing articles on fears and anxiety, I found articles about people eating Sputnik burgers and Sputnik sundaes and getting Sputnik hairdos, which are pretty awful, really. Especially this one and this one. And having Sputnik cocktails. Lots of bars coming up with a Sputnik cocktail. There are stories about kids naming their class Goldfish Sputnik. There was an article about how people were a lot more upset about the economy than they were concerned about Sputnik. There's even several articles about how the AP sent its reporters to 2 different average cities, one in the north and one in the south, to kind of sample public opinion. And they found that average Americans appear unconcerned, with Wisconsinites refusing to admit that the U.S. was lagging behind Russia. And their response to bringing Sputnik up was to make jokes about it, as the people, quote, show little sign of deep concern. And then you had people from Gatlinburg, Tennessee, noting that America's satellites will be twice as big when they get theirs out, with the AP reporter concluding, when the average man in the South speaks about the Russian satellites at all today, and you don't hear much talk of them, he is more likely to joke than to express anxiety or outright fear.
How do you feel about it?
Well, I just think they beat us to the punch. We've been talking about it and working on it, but nothing's happened.
I mean, one article I found in the Spokesman Review even straight up calls for psychological warfare experts to come up with a new name to stir the pride of Americans, out of concern that the word Sputnik had so penetrated the American consciousness that the nation might start referring to American satellites as Sputniks too, which would be very bad. So we needed a new word, and psychological warfare experts need to figure out what will make us feel more prideful so we don't call our satellites Sputniks, because everyone liked that word. I mean, how does this match up with a collective mental turmoil with soul searching?
We may be witnesses to a biblical prophecy come true, and there shall be destruction and darkness come upon creation, and the beast shall reign over the earth.
The only appropriate characterization that begins to capture the mood of 5 October involves use of the word hysteria. Like,
Do you think it'll mean we'll get to the moon soon?
I hope so. I'd like to go up there.
where's the evidence of any of this hysteria? Interestingly, I did find a top-level scientific report by the American Rocket Society, whose president just so happened to be a commander in the U.S. Navy at the time, was already proposing a federal space flight program to the moon within 20 years, which is a report that just so happened to come out 2 days before Sputnik was launched. But here's the real kicker. What if I told you the American scientific community, and thus the defense community, because that was all kind of one thing in the Cold War, knew about Sputnik for at least 2 years before it was actually launched? Because yeah, they did. So here's this memo, and it's a proposed news release from the National Academy of Sciences dated June 1957, which it says not for release except by specific authority of the National Academy of Sciences, so I'm guessing they didn't actually release this one. Because if you read this, what it tells you is they knew this was going to happen since 1955, because it was all part of a plan that everyone knew about. So you have a statement here from Dr. Detlev Bronk, who just, by the way, was concurrently president of the Rockefeller University at the same time he was president of the National Academy of Sciences. And he's just casually mentioning here, they have now learned of detailed Soviet plans for the launching of an artificial Earth satellite. And not just for no reason or because they decided to suddenly, it's actually part of the scientific program for the International Geophysical Year, which is what 1957 to 58 was.
July 1st marks the beginning of one of the great scientific adventures of our time, the International Geophysical Year. During this period, which will actually be 18 months long, the scientists of the United States will join their efforts with those of the scientists of some 60 other nations to make the most intensive study ever undertaken of our planet.
And that this was formally announced to them back in 1956. It says here an announcement to that effect was made last September by Soviet representatives at a meeting of the International Committee that guides the overall planning for the IGY. And then it says earlier references to such a program were made in general terms by Soviet scientists in the summer of 1955, shortly after the formal announcement of the United States Scientific Earth Satellite Program was made, July 29, 1955, to the International IGY Committee. We welcome the release of further details on the Soviet plans at this time. Both the United States and the Soviet announcements followed the recommendation of the International IGY Committee that each participating nation consider whether it could undertake such a program. The committee based its recommendation on its conclusion that measurements of great significance to science and great potential benefit to humanity could be obtained with satellites.
The Secretary of Defense announced this morning that the Army is to participate in the International Geophysical Year satellite program.
So they were told to do it. The Soviets were told to do it by the committee for the IGY, and it was well known, and then their detailed plans to do so were given up to the National Academy of Sciences, who all knew about this, and they proposed a news release about it in June of 1957, months before it was actually launched.
The most important result of the International Geophysical Year is the demonstration of the ability of peoples of all nations to work together harmoniously for the common good.
And you know what's missing from this memo? Shock, confusion, anxiety, fear, hysteria. There's none of that. It's mentioned by Dr. Bronk really rather matter of fact and just kind of blah. It's just known for years in advance. It's going to be cool for science. Everyone's going to be sharing data and information with each other. Not a big deal, because the Soviets and the United States were part of the International Geophysical Year, and that was something the committee of that institution planned for them to undertake and asked them if they would do it.
The Jet Propulsion Laboratory has been assigned the responsibility by the U.S. National Committee of the IGY and by the Army to complete the design and construction of these experiments in a suitable form for the Army rocket.
The week that Sputnik was launched actually coincided with a 6-day conference for the International Geophysical Year at the National Academy of Sciences in Washington that was specifically on rocket and satellite research for the IGY, that included scientists from the United States, the Soviet Union, and 5 other nations on their plans to share data and findings from their research on this topic.
Following the announcement by the Secretary of Defense, numerous planning conferences were held in Washington, D.C., Huntsville, Alabama, and Pasadena, California.
So this was all super known, very much known, not even remotely a little bit of a surprise. So there you go, okay? Because the story that's gone down claims the whole reason that NASA suddenly had to exist and DARPA suddenly had to exist and a very unpopular national defense education program was suddenly pushed through is because the American people were just so hysterical and so afraid they practically demanded it. They were at Capitol Hill just banging down the door, begging them to institute these agencies, just demanding it.
I think we are all doomed.
And yet there's really just no evidence. There's no evidence this was a scary surprise or even much of a surprise at all, apparently, to a lot of people, it would appear. So why is that the story that's gone down? Because people actually seemed pretty excited about Sputnik in a lot of ways. I mean, they were fixing their hair in Sputnik hairdos.
Wow.
Is that what you do when you're terrified? It just... The Sputnik crisis appears created. It appears made up. It appears completely fake. But you have NASA historian Lanius over here claiming, quote, the launch of Sputnik 1 had a Pearl Harbor effect on American public opinion. It was a shock, introducing the average citizen to the space age in a crisis setting.
That smells like bullshit.
Why did they have to introduce the average citizen to the space age in a crisis setting? And that's the whole relationship now that is the history of people to space. I just can't seem to locate any evidence to support that people were actually hysterical. And apparently neither can Kim McQuaid, who published an article called Sputnik Reconsidered, Image and Reality in the Early Space Age in the winter 2007 edition of Canadian Review of American Studies. who found, quote, chroniclers regularly affirm that Russia's Sputniks produced popular crisis. More nuanced explanations argue that a preliminary media riot made cosmic space races an essential counterpart of earthly missile races in the public mind. Widespread public interest and political support for the U.S. civilian space program during its formative years is presumed, as is the concept that space explorations were a key global determinant of U.S. Cold War prestige. Such ideas are overdrawn. Contemporary analysts often studied to confirm what they already knew. Unattractive official findings were censored or ignored. Surveying all formerly secret and other opinion data about civilian space exploration from Sputnik 1 to the end of the Mercury program shows how space exploration advocates helped create elite panic regarding the Sputniks via selective reporting, while wider publics generally stayed indifferent to lunar and planetary missions. Elite panic, not mass panic, impelled the priorities and programs of the early space age.
Because nothing says panic like elite panic.
I even found a historian who wrote a chapter on this. Where'd it go? Talking about how JFK wasn't particularly interested in space and privately admitted the whole escapade was a waste of money. But he nevertheless knew the rewards to be reaped from a frightened electorate. But it doesn't even seem like they were that frightened. So there's elite panic, which just sounds like manufactured panic, which they couldn't even really manufacture is the thing. Why did I show you this? I was looking for something else, tangentially related, but not this. And then I just stumbled into this, like, oh, it's another elevator in the Truman Show.
What's happening?
Nothing. Why? Because it bothers the shit out of me, guys. Why is it that everything in our society is done in this crisis mode?
You never want a serious crisis to go to waste. And what I mean by that, it's an opportunity to do things that you think you could not do before.
Where they have to make it seem like there's a crisis happening. Why does every piece of progress humanity gets to have to start in this way? It's not even a real crisis. It is a manufactured, phony crisis. But there's always some bloody battle or some horrible event. You know, if it's not Pearl Harbor, then it's Sputnik. If it's not Sputnik, then it's Gulf of Tonkin getting us into the Vietnam War, which was a false flag, or the Challenger explosion, or Y2K, or 9/11, or whatever. There's always something, right? Because we can't just be excited about the future. We have to be terrified of it every single time with some fake manufactured crisis. And this means they started the entire space age basically on a lie. That's what it means.
It is now a matter of history that at 5 seconds past 10:55 p.m. on January 31st, 1958, Satellite Explorer was placed in orbit. This achievement is another step forward in man's drive to better understand the world and universe in which he lives. We are no longer earthbound. Soon we will begin to explore the solar system far beyond the boundaries of our tiny world. In the years to come, man will continue to use rocket vehicles like Jupiter C to expand the frontiers of knowledge.
Even small children understand the concept that if you start an endeavor on a lie, it's not going to go well. Once you start on a lie, there's really nowhere else to go but more lies. Because you have to tell more lies to cover up the lie you already told. You have to keep telling lies, unless you tell the truth, which they didn't do. They're still not doing. To this day, they're still not doing it. It's kind of amazing. To this day, you still have the New York Times being like, it was the 9/11 of their time. No, it wasn't. It wasn't actually the 9/11 of anyone's time. There's no evidence to show that it was. I think they wanted it to be the 9/11 of everyone's time, although that's the question. Why? Why did they want that to be? Was it really just to create an illusion of a technological gap, which at least the NASA historian admits was an illusion that they created? The event created an illusion of a technological gap to provide the impetus for increased spending for aerospace endeavors, and they couldn't get people excited about it in any other way. It had to be done in this way, really. And then you've got people who just repeat that information as if this is the true story, and it's not. And why is that okay for them? Why is it okay for some people to just repeat talking points about what supposedly happened, and they're not interested to actually go look at what actually did happen? which is a lot of times not the same. I don't understand it. You know, I think it's so bizarre that as an American, I can throw a rock in almost any direction. I don't even have to throw it that far. Actually, the rock could just kind of fall out of my pocket, and I'm finding some stuff like this. Why is that? Because that's messed up, okay? That feels so weird. I thought this was a basic, known piece of information, and it's not. It's not. And the sad part is I could do this all day, especially during the Cold War period, but you could do it with lots of other periods too. In fact, the entire 20th century is rife with this stuff, if you just go look. But it's just really sad that we have to live that way, and that we've not stopped living that way. And in order to understand where you are, you have to look at where we've actually been. Because this is a formula. This manufactured crisis is a formula that is used. And I guess they just think everyone is not intelligent enough to handle the truth, so we're going to infantilize everyone and keep them in a childlike state by constantly lying about everything. But, you know, that's not really good for human consciousness. It doesn't bode well for any of the promises of the future. And by the way, the same formula is being used. We're living in it right now. Everything that's about to happen, same formula. I mean, look at what just got done happening for the last 4 years. It's the same formula. And you could say, well, they do it because it works. Well, it didn't really work, though, because people didn't believe it. People didn't believe it at the time. They didn't believe it. It's only since then, with lots of distance, they've been able to kind of continue to reaffirm that that's what happened. And now that's what people think happened because that's what they've heard. But it's not actually what occurred. I don't know, isn't anyone else sick and tired of this being the way everything is? Why does it have to be this way? All those images of the future and how cool it could be, you can't do that if you base everything on just lies and fake crises and bullshit. It's not ever going to happen. It will never happen. So that's really sad. That's sad for everyone. So why'd I show you this? I don't know. I'm surprised that it's just one more thing. It's just one more lie. Guess just throw it on the pile of lies. Yay, we live on a freaking throne of lies. But I still look up at the night sky all the time and wonder what we aren't being told about space.
We may be witnessing the beginning of an era that will mean the complete annihilation of man.
Oh, and by the way, here's an article that came out October 25th, 1957, so a couple weeks after the launch of Sputnik. Mystery surrounds mothballed satellites. One of the unpublished facts about the American Sputnik snafu is that the Army has 6 satellites in a warehouse in Huntsville, Alabama, all ready to launch and could have been launched before the Sputnik, thus keeping the USA ahead of the USSR in science and preventing one of the greatest psychological defeats the US ever suffered. But for some strange and mysterious reason difficult to fathom, the Army was under orders not to launch these satellites.